So in this one, we'll be looking at the session hijacking and both of the network and the client level. So we're going to be talking about the TCP, UDP and also man in the browser attack. And so while this while is still session hijacking is a very different threat to what we have been seeing in terms of session hijacking in a web application. So let's go and take a look about what I am going to cover in this one. So we are going to predominantly network level focus throughout the remainder of this, and we'll get one thing really close upfront, and we'll talk about the network level session hijacking, and this is the risk we have to largely pass now. So certainly when you look at where the proportion of hijacking attacks are, but in modern days of application and network, it's at the web layer of the network and the network layer form a very small part of session hijacking takes today. So this is a little bit of, as I said here, a remnant of a bygone era. Now the reason I am including it is because if you are working toward your switch network, and level session hijacking is one of the things they talk about. But as you will see, we will progress through this one, and most of these examples are presence of a TCP level hijack in particular, and some are old, but it may be an interesting history lesson, so we are going to cover it here. We are just not going to go as in depth, but we are going to just for the web application live. Now when we talk about the network level session and the session hijacking, we are talking about the layer 4 of the OSI model, and that's the network layer so far. So we have been only looking at layer 7, which is actually up at the app layer. So we are going to get down to the lower in the stack, and as we progress you will see the different level of details to what we have seen before. So we have actually going to be looking at the pocket level on the network layer. Now firstly I mentioned that we are going to be looking at both TCP and UDP, and if you are not already aware of the difference between these two protocols, don't worry, I am going to make it clear that we can go into this, and I will explain how the risk of session hijacking differs between the two, because they are pretty much fundamentally different communication protocols. And finally we are going to take a look at the risk of the client. So we are actually going to talk about a man in the browser attack, whether client software is compromised. So not in the application here, not the network here, but the browser running on the victim machine. So that's a quite different attack vector when the attacker can actually control what's inside on the operating system or within the browser. So that's what we are going to look at. Let's move on and start to understand the TCP protocol and understand the TCP protocol a little bit better before we start looking at session hijacking across it. So here is the TCP level session hijacking attack. So we are going to look at its IP spoofing. Now what we talk about the IP spoofing is the attack that it doesn't need to guess the sequence number or get to the middle of the communication, because there's not necessarily a connection or already open with the target machine. IP spoofing for the purpose of network level session, and which is the session hijacking, and it takes advantage of source and route package. So this is where the sender of a packet can partially or completely specify the route. and the packet takes the network. So let's take a look how this works. So firstly, let's bring our attacker in. Now attacker is going to determine the IP address of a trusted host. Once they've got it, they can construct what's referred to as a source route packet. So that's a packet where the sender actually determines the route it is going to take. So obviously this is all dependent on the environment, and which are allowing the source routed as opposed to delegating the routing to actual owner. And because of the actual router, but doing that, the attacker is able to fool the server into believing that it's communicating with the victim. So effectively they're supposed to do that address, and they've just sent the packet to the target machine. Now once they do that, they can desynchronize the connection with the victim and resume it themselves. So there's IP spoofing. There are a number of things that have to be very specific in place, that is specific network environment for it to happen, but certainly that is the one mechanism of TCP level session, and which is the session hijacking, and that's the end of the TCP. So let's look at to protect against the IP spoofing. So use the strong verification and authentication method for all remote access, and do not authenticate devices and uses solely based on IP address. Makes an SEL of IP addresses, and use both ingress and egress packet filtering, and use antivirus and other security software that watches the suspicious network activity. And the use IP level encryption protocol to protect traffic going to and from the enterprise server. This approach keeps attacker from reading potential IP addresses to impersonate, and keep network software updated, and practice good patch management, and performing ongoing network monitoring can help to protect against this IP spoofing. To understand UDP level hijacking, let's just do a quick UDP 101. So UDP is a connectionless transition model, and it is a bare minimum protocol mechanism. So for example, there is a handshaking, and there is no resiliency against unreliability and underlying network, and as well as packets and that are sent and just forgotten about. As I said earlier, this works great for communication mechanism where speed is much more important than reliability. So again, something like VoIP, but because there is no acknowledgement of the receipt and the packages, and never know what it's actually reach the destination, and in some ways that actually makes session hijacking. So session hijacking is a bit easier because we don't have host and clients. Looking forward responses from the other one acknowledging receipt. What all this means is, in terms of session hijacking, is that the attack it doesn't need to worry about the synchronizing the connection. Like as an example, in TCP hijacking, they can just send the packets and block packets without having to worry about anything like acknowledgements. So let's take this as an example. I say the victim sends a UDP request to the server. So we're going to bring out the tackler in. So after bringing out the attacker in, and because the server has a chance to respond with its own UDP packets, the attacker is going to forge your response to the victim. So I guess this is a bit of a risk condition. So long as the attacker can get in first, they will be one to successfully send the request and the responses. But the attack, it could go even further if they can successfully mount a man and in the minute of connection, because they could look for the responses from the server and simply block it. So the server isn't expecting an acknowledgement from the response. There is that the TCP isn't anymore, so it really has no way to knowing that its packets of actually arrived in the victim and arriving at a victim at a same time, the response. So there are a couple of different levels and they are for the attacker to clearly forging. So after forging its own response and beating the server, it is a very, I would say, time critical exercise. Whether the blocking the response does require a man in the middle as well. So there is a couple of different ways to hijacking. So UDPs as well as and let's move on to take a bit something different in the browser attack, and let's discuss about the UDP session hijacking. So since UDP does not use packet sequencing and synchronizing, it's easier than TPA to hijack the UDP session. I would say this hijacker has simply to force the server to reply a client on the UDP, and the UDP request before the server can respond. So if sniffing is used, then it will be easier to control and it will be easier to control the traffic generating from the side of the server, thus the restricting server replied client in the first place and force server to reply client UDP before it responds, and basically it's easier to control the traffic in the first place.